Speaking of, we're going to be going through a F my life. Speaking of, we're going to be going through a sociology session. How do you even say the word? Sociology. Speaking of, we're going to be going through a psych-soc passage this week. So let's get right into it. So if you're not familiar, and you're probably not because we're kind of just starting this thing, John and I are going to be going through the AAMC sample test, and we're going to take it passage by passage, section by section. We're doing this because we like to provide free resources for you guys, but if it's resources that you guys have to go buy to follow along with our video, then it kind of defeats the purpose. But the sample test is something that's free to any student that has a AAMC account. So this week we're going to be going through, like I said, a psych-soc passage. We haven't really done a lot of those videos. We've mostly stuck to like BB, CARS, and CP because those are the ones that a lot of students struggle with. But I have known quite a few students that have struggled with psych-soc simply because they don't have a lot of exposure. I'm a little bit of a psychology connoisseur as well. It's what I got my degree in. This is the passage number 1 in the AAMC sample test for the psych-soc section. I'm going to provide the passage right now, so you guys can read through it, flowchart, do whatever you need to do, but we're going to be answering questions on this passage right here. If you're interested in how I flowchart a passage, kind of like this, then I'll provide it right now. Overall, I find myself not doing a lot of flowcharting on psych-soc. Pretty much the passages are short and they're pretty digestible most of the time. So most of my notes, they kind of go into like experimental methods and like making sure that I understand how the experiments are running. So you can see I kind of like separated my groups and talked about how we're doing word recall and then recognition, and also my basic science that I'm pretty sure we're going to be asked a question on, which is the serial position effect. You guys should have picked up on that right away when it said they're interested in finding out what they remember or recall from different parts of the list. So I do want to talk about one thing that I always do with psych-soc, and that's make sure that I understand the figures. The results are almost always going to be in the figures, and so I'm going to be using a lot of those figure interpretation drills that I have talked about in this video. I don't know where it's going to be, but I'm going to put it in there. So you can go and watch that if you're not familiar with some of the things I'm doing. So let's look at figure 1 right now. You see that number of words is on the y-axis, okay? So looks like that's what we're testing. That's our dependent variable. Study group is divided into ages, and it's also divided into, like Alzheimer's has its own group, but it told us the age of the Alzheimer's patients. So we can see that it's broken up between recall, which is in black, and recognition, which is in gray. So some things I'm noticing is that like as people get older, it looks like their recall kind of goes down, and then Alzheimer's kind of like continues that, but the Alzheimer's patients are the same age as the 60 to 80 group, so obviously they're having trouble recalling more so than the other people their age, which is Alzheimer's. Something interesting about recognition is that it kind of like, you see it kind of goes down a little bit, but then it kind of comes back up. And so it looks like overall they're not changing like a whole lot. I don't know if it's significant statistically. There's no like error bars or anything like that, but I'm going to go ahead and go on a limb and say that there's probably not a lot of difference in recognition between the age groups. But Alzheimer's does have a significant drop off between recognition. So Alzheimer's people cannot recall as well, and they also cannot recognize things near as well. Another thing that I find is interesting is that there's a big difference between recall and recognition between every age group with normal memory, which It's pretty typical. We as humans can typically recognize more things than we can just recall off the top of our head. We can, if we see a word, we're like, oh yeah, I was on the list, rather than just like spitting them out. But the Alzheimer's patients had the exact same recall and recognition, which I think is really interesting. And I kind of wonder if they're going to ask a question on it. So that's all with that figure. But, when I was going through, I kind of did all that in like 30, 40 seconds. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Figure 2 is where they're talking about the serial position effect. So we see like a very typical serial position effect between the ages of 20 to 80. It goes down in the middle. So you have your primacy effect at the beginning and then your recency effect at the end. And then the middle of the list is when you had the fewest percentage of the words recalled. Very typical. So just put that in your mind like, okay, normal results for people with normal memory. But with the Alzheimer's patients, we see something completely different and really interesting. So they remembered like LOL nothing about the beginning of the list and really nothing about the middle of the list. But as you got towards the end, they remembered like everything. Which is like totally weird. So it looks like all of those words that they recalled were from the end of the list. And again, I'm going to figure out those results and everything in about 20, 30 seconds. I'm not going to spend that much more time on that figure. I'll refer to it later if they ask a question on it. But question number 1 says, which statement is not supported by the data in figure 1? Okay, so let's think about figure 1. That's the one that had all the, it was like the bar graph of the recall versus recognition. I'll put it up right here so you guys can refer to it. So A says as people grow older, their ability to recall declines. So that recall was the black bar, I believe. Yeah, recall was the black bar. And so we do see that as people get older, it looks like that trend is kind of going down. So I think that's probably a true statement. I'm going to go ahead and say probably not on A. B says recognition is relatively stable in adults without memory impairments. So those adults without memory impairments would be the normal age groups. And we did see that recognition was relatively stable. Again, that's one of those things that we talked about in our figure interpretation, which is why figure interpretation is so important. Because you can go through this question super fast without really having to refer back to the figure that much if you put in the work beforehand. So I think that that's pretty true. And we're looking for something that's not supported. So probably not B either. C, the memory problems in Alzheimer's disease are an acceleration of the aging process. So kind of what that means is that we should see Alzheimer's patients just continuing the trends that we saw in the other age ranges, but just more pronounced. And the thing about this is recall, maybe I can see that it's just an acceleration. If we had like a 90 to 100 age range, then maybe that's what their recall would look like. But recognition didn't really change among the age groups. And so if this was just an acceleration of the aging process, then we should see recognition not really changing. But you see that recognition is really low in Alzheimer's patients. So that's not really in trend with the rest of the graph. And so it's not really an acceleration of the aging process. It's something different. So I'll say maybe on C. I kind of like it. It's not really supported. D says participants without memory impairments perform better in the recognition test compared to the recall test. So this is clearly indicated by the graph. Those recognition bars are super high and they're a lot higher than the recall task. So C is my correct answer. It's the only one that's really not supported by the figure. 2 says the finding in the last paragraph regarding the retrieval of related words supports. Okay, so this was the part in the passage where, I'll find it. It says, a finding emerged right here that from the recall test that the participants without memory impairments retrieved words that were related to the words on the list but had not actually appeared. Again, this is a typical thing that we see in memory science. So this question is basically asking, if I was to simplify it, like what basic science does that relate to? A says spreading activation. So what is that? That's when honestly, a good example is the paragraph, because I think that's the right answer. I mean, I know it's the right answer. I know the right answer, but I don't want to give it away. But at the same time, I know it's the right answer. Spreading activation is like when you're prompted, like your memory is prompted by a word or an idea. And similar words or ideas are kind of also brought to your cognition's forefront, for lack of a better word. Say the word collar was on the recall task, but we recalled the word leash. That's because those words in our mind are kind of connected in, I think they're called like memory webs or semantic networks or something like that. And so it's almost like it spreads out from that original word into kind of related words. So I like that answer. I think that describes it really well. B says depth of processing. I don't even know what that is. On a lot of psych soc, there's so many definitions. You're not going to be solid on all of them probably. So you kind of have to use context clues and just decide. If you don't know what it is and it doesn't sound right, then it probably isn't right. So I don't think that, recalling related words has anything to do with how deep you're processing something. I don't even really know what that means. C says the serial position effect. This is like name dropping. It's trying to get you to pick that answer just because you know that the passage does test the serial position effect. But retrieving related words doesn't have anything to do with the serial position effect. D, the existence of visuospatial sketchpad. So the visuospatial sketchpad. So again, retrieving related words doesn't have anything to do with like visuals or, our spatial memory or anything like that. It just has to do with those memory networks that I was talking about earlier and spreading activation. And so A is the right answer there. 3, in figure 2, the group of Alzheimer's patients demonstrated a clear... Okay, so figure 2, I'll pop it up right here. That's the one that had the serial position effect, and we saw like a clear primacy and recency effect for the normal memoried people. But we kind of mentioned that Alzheimer's people had like no memory of the beginning of the list, but a whole lot of memory from the end of the list. And so what is that? That's the recency effect. I have no clue what those are. They're probably things, but they're not things you need to know for the MCAT. You only need to know the primacy and the recency effect in regards to the serial position effect for the MCAT. 4 is proactive interference expected in Alzheimer's patients for the word list used in the study. So what's proactive interference, guys? So there's retroactive and there's proactive interference. Proactive interference is when something is interfering with new information, specifically old information. So imagine that you go get a new phone number and you cannot seem to remember your new phone number because your old phone number is like what keeps popping up in your brain when you think of your phone number. That's old information interfering with new information. Retroactive interference is when new information interferes with the recall of old information. So let's imagine the same scenario. You get a new phone number and you memorize it, and then you try to think of your old phone number and you just can't seem to think of it because all you can have in your memory now for phone number is your new phone number. So that new information is interfering with the recall of old information. But we're talking about proactive here. So is proactive interference going to be an issue for Alzheimer's patients? Think about what Alzheimer's is. They forget stuff that they used to know. Like they have like really poor long-term memory. Obviously, we saw from the figure 2 that they have a pretty good short-term memory. They had that really strong recency effect, but they don't have that old information. And so that old information is probably not going to be able to impede in that new information. Let's see if there's an answer that says something like that. A says yes, because their memory is weaker than all other groups. I'm sorry, just saying that it's weaker, that sounds so... These poor Alzheimer's patients. Making them most vulnerable to proactive interference. So, again, that doesn't really say anything about... They don't really have that old information to impede in that new information. So, like, having a weak memory would not increase your proactive interference. If anything, it would, like, make it better, right? Like if you didn't have the memories, then it can't interfere. They can't interfere with new information. So I don't like that answer at all. B says yes, because their working memory appears to be functioning, and that is where proactive interference takes place. So proactive interference actually takes into account that long-term memory. Working memory is your short-term memory, basically. So that's not what proactive interference is talking about. That's not what interference, period, is talking about. C, no, because proactive interference requires information previously stored in long-term memory, which can impede the learning of new information. So that's basically saying the definition of proactive interference and why it's not a problem for Alzheimer's patients. So that's kind of what I was saying earlier, and I really like that answer. Not going to mark it yet, though, because I never mark what I think is the correct answer until I've read all the answers. D, no, because proactive interference requires an intact temporal cortex, and Alzheimer's patients have damage to the temporal cortex. I have beef with this answer choice. I don't like the way it's worded. It kind of makes it sound like Alzheimer's patients have some acute damage only to the temporal cortex, which is your cortex like right here by your ears. Includes like, it does include part of memory, but it also includes like language and stuff like that. And Alzheimer's patients just have a neurodegeneration of their cerebral cortex as a whole. So it's not specific to the temporal cortex, and I wouldn't say specifically that proactive interference is located to the temporal cortex. Like we don't have the science to say that as far as I'm aware. And I think C is a better answer. 5, and I'm pretty sure I got these out of order. So I think that this is actually number 4 on the AAMC test, and the previous one was number 5, but let's just roll with it. 5 says, which conclusion can be drawn from figure 2 based on the recall pattern of participants without memory impairments? So figure 2, again, was talking about the serial position effect. So I think it's basically just going to talk something about that. I don't know. I haven't read the answer choices. Let's just see if they give us any hints. A, short-term memory is the activated part of sensory memory. I just don't know that that's really a true statement. The way it typically goes is that sensory memory is that really short, like less than probably 2 seconds, I would say, memory where you can when you're talking to somebody and they say something to you, but you weren't really paying attention to it. And so you just say, what? Just reflexively. And then right after you say what, you could basically replay it in your head perfectly, exactly how they said it. And you're like, how did I know what they said when I didn't know what they said? So that's what's called echoic memory, and it's kind of a subsection of sensory memory. We can do it with our eyes too. That's called iconic memory. And this is all stuff you need to know for the MCAT. So imagine you are shown a flash of a page that has numbers on it, and it's there. You get to look at it, and then it goes away. Well, for 1 second, we have a perfect map of what that page looked like and where everything was. It's kind of difficult to quantify that memory though, because it is so short-lived, and we really we can't redraw it really, because that would take more than 1 second, which is about how long that iconic memory is. So typically that sensory memory, once we pay attention to it, it turns into short-term memory, and that attention aspect is actually kind of important. When I say attention, that's the actual psychological term for how we take things from sensory memory to short-term memory. We pay attention to them. So I'm not really cool with saying that short-term memory is the activated part of sensory memory. Short-term memory and sensory memory are not the same thing. If anything, I would say sensory memory is maybe a subsection of short-term memory. That may be something that's considered, but I just don't like this answer choice. I don't think it even has anything to do with figure 2, because there's no sensory memory that we're talking about. B, short-term memory is the activated part of long-term memory. Again, I don't really like this answer choice because how we turn memory from short term to long term, which is what you guys should be doing with your MCAT studies, is that we purposely, what's it called? Rehearsal. We purposely rehearse it. So there's maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal, but basically we rehearse that memory until it becomes part of our long-term memory. So I wouldn't say that short-term memory is the activated part of long-term memory, and I just don't think I don't think that answer choice describes figure 2 either. Kind of like A. C, short-term memory and long-term memory are uniform and function similarly. So glancing at D and seeing that it kind of has a similar structure, what I think they're trying to do is draw this line between short and long-term memory using figure 2 and using that serial position effect. So I think typically what it is that they say, okay, well, the primacy effect, those words at the beginning of the list, they've probably converted themselves into long-term memory at this point. Short-term memory is really short. It's like 1 minute long. And so probably that recency effect is going to be working more in your short-term memory. The primacy effect is going to be working more in your long-term memory. So do short-term memory and long-term memory, are they uniform and do they function similarly? From my knowledge of memory, I'm going to say that I don't really like that answer choice. I think, I don't know, like maybe, I don't know, because you do see like a symmetry between the primacy and the recency effects. But Alzheimer's kind of messes that up, and you can see that Alzheimer's patients have that short-term memory, but not that long-term memory. And so that kind of throws a wrench in it. And maybe they are not uniform and they do not function similarly. So I don't know. I'm just going to say maybe on C, but I'm hoping D is better. So D says short-term memory and long-term memory represent separate memory systems. So from my knowledge and from you guys' knowledge or what you should have for the MCAT, you should know that they do represent different memory systems. Like memory as a whole pretty much branches off into long-term over here and short-term over here. Maybe sensory is another category. But they do represent different memory systems, and that would explain why Alzheimer's patients have the short term but not the long term. And so I like that answer choice better. I think that it's D. Again, you can see I'm not totally solid on this answer. Like, I know it's correct, and I'm still not totally solid. I'm kind of like 50-50 between C and D, but D just explains the figure better, and so that's what I'm going to go with, and it also backs up that basic science that I know better. So I'm going with D. So that was the end of the passage. As always, if you have any questions, just put them in the comments. We've gotten a few comments lately about like, do we offer a program for MCAT tutoring or do we offer private tutoring? I do currently offer private tutoring at this time. John's in medical school, so he doesn't have the time to do that. But if you're interested in that, think you would benefit, then you can email us at informingfuturedoctors@gmail.com. We can set up a Zoom to talk about it. So give this video a thumbs up and let me know what plant I should get next, to be honest. I'm looking for something like really obnoxious and that's gonna like come in the screen. This alocasia is giving though, look at her. Okay, anyway, see you next time.